The race for president finally winds through KC. The mayor says farewell with a candid new book, marking a tragedy 1 year on. The head of Lee Summit School's back in the headlines, this time for blasting the president. It's our Metro's most impactful stories dissected next on your Week in Review.
Week in Review is made possible through the generous support of Dave and Jamie Cummings, Bob and Marlise Gorley, Smithfield Foods, Haas and Wilkerson Insurance, the Courtney S. Turner Charitable Trust, John H. Mize and Bank of America N.A. co-trustees, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Nick Haynes. Glad you could join us as we take a journey together through the news of our week. I was a little worried part of our production set might have melted in what has been a sweltering few days here in our Metroplex, but calm, cool, and totally unfazed are this week's news reviewers. Mr. Up-to-Date on KCUR-FM, Steve Kraske. From the Call newspaper, senior writer Eric Wesson. From 41 Action News, reporter Kat Reed. And columnist and editorial writer Dave Helling of your Kansas City Star. The race for president has finally come to Kansas City. This week, Mayor Pete in the Metro for 2 fundraisers and a stop to witness the work of a homeless veterans project in South Kansas City. He's joined by some familiar faces, including former Missouri Secretary of State Jason Kander and Mayor-elect Quinton Lucas. There are now more than 20 candidates running for president. Why is Mayor Pete the first to come here? Does he have a tie to Kansas City, Kat?
Well, there are a couple of things. He's leading the polls currently in Iowa, which is our neighbor. And also, I think that, like Jason Kander, he's a Democratic darling. He has that relationship with Kander. Really, though, Quinton Lucas, the mayor-elect, says it's all about the Veterans Community Project, and he credited just the mission of that project with bringing Mayor Pete, a military veteran, here.
What did we learn about this visit this week, Steve?
Well, that politicians who are running for president, Nick, love to be associated with veterans issues, veterans housing. I have a prediction. This won't be the last presidential candidate who comes to Kansas City who makes his way to the Veterans Community Project. They love those kinds of things. It's a great issue for presidential candidates.
So we're going to see Elizabeth Warren go to one of these in Kansas City? We're going to see Joe Biden here?
Yeah, you might over time, and other candidates. It's a good place to raise money, and money is the mother's milk of presidential politics at this stage. We should keep in mind a couple of things. First of all, to me, the more interesting development this week was the reemergence of Jason Kander, who had circumstances been different, might be getting ready to take the oath as the next mayor in Kansas City. Instead, he had a very well publicized problem that he is now addressing. And he can still be a force, I think, in Missouri politics and maybe national politics. His reemergence is probably as important for us around here as maybe Mayor Pete.
Is he really talking, though, about any campaigns, Eric?
No, I was surprised to see him out, too. I thought I would have saw him out in Jolie Justice's campaign, supporting her since she supported him. But that was the first time I saw him this week.
Ken.
One other thing I'll point out about Buttigieg visiting VCP is that really sets up the distinction of him from the rest of the field, in that he talks a lot about being a veteran and his military service, that being part of his broader public service. So I think that kind of tees him up. Also, that would be his distinction from President Trump.
Yeah, can I just throw in quickly sort of a corollary issue, Nick? Missouri is thinking about canceling its presidential primary next year, which would be very interesting. Republicans are in essence saying we don't need a primary. Donald Trump is going to be our nominee. Why should we spend public money to help the Democrats pick a presidential candidate? And of course, the Kansas Democrats are moving away from caucuses. They're going to do a sort of a different kind of polling mechanism. So how much attention we get presidentially may narrow as we get closer to the choices.
You know, politics is a relationship game, Nick. And just a reminder, Jason Kander was running for president at one point in his life just a couple of years ago, and he knows all these people. He has a relationship with Mayor Pete, a relationship with virtually every other presidential candidate who's running on the Democratic side. You know, it's not hard to imagine that as much attention as Mayor Pete is getting these days, that could have been Jason Kander under a different set of scenarios.
But back to your first question, I don't know if a lot of the candidates in the Democratic side will be parading through Kansas City. It's basically a Republican state, and I think a lot of them, I know Cory Booker is like, well, I don't know if I'm going to come there because it's basically a Republican state now.
With just days before he heads out of office, Mayor Sly James is out with a new book. He's calling it Passion for Purpose. and it's being released just as he presides over his final council meeting this week and holds a farewell picnic at the Urban Youth Academy. What did we learn from the book that we didn't already know?
He can carry a grudge, Nick. He doesn't like Dave Helling. Dave is one of the very few people the mayor singles out for his animus as he heads out the door. The two of them got into it over the bidding process for the airport, or the lack of a bidding process. And that says something about Mayor James, that he's going out of office feeling he needs to settle some scores as he leaves the scene. I'm not sure it was necessary in that way. Having said that, the book is a really interesting look at his life, an interesting man, an interesting upbringing, and I think people would get something out of it.
I thought he removed all of the names from the book to protect the innocent or perhaps the guilty.
Well, there is a mention just by last name of Mayor-elect Quinton Lucas, in which he criticizes the hiring of outside law firms, outside counsel. So there is just one little dig. He says that it wasn't intentional.
Dave Helling, given what Steve just said, are you doing a rebuttal book that's going to come out in the next few weeks?
No, I'm lamenting my loss of a key to the city. I was hoping I would get a key to the city here at the end, and it doesn't look like that's going to happen. It's no secret that the mayor and I have had discussions for his entire term about my views on how government should be open to the people and his views, which are different, and that may be reflected in the book. I do think it's interesting at some point he says, paraphrasing here, that I'm not a politician, I'm not interested in legacies, which is an interesting statement to put in a book about your legacy.
When he says he's not interested in legacies, then, Eric Weston, what is he going to be best remembered for?
You know, he has the glitzy projects, you know, the airport, the downtown hotel, but I think he wants to be remembered for trying to do something with education with young people. I think he spent a lot of time focusing on, you know, the young people, the situations that he had at the plaza, and then he started the youth program there. So I think it's going to be youth.
A lot of people said at his farewell cookout that he's kind of the mayor that made Kansas City believe in itself again, that kind of put us more on a national stage. And so that's what I heard from the people who I interviewed on that Sunday.
Steve?
You know, I think when a lot of Kansas Cityans think about Mayor James, they'll think about him getting the airport terminal off the ground. They'll thinking about the downtown convention hotel. And it's interesting because one of my theories is that Kansas Cityans demand to some degree that their mayors provide some major capital improvement projects to improve their lives here. Now, it's interesting because Mayor-elect Quinton Lucas is thinking just the opposite. He's sort of spurning that idea of the need to provide a major project. Instead, he wants to focus on important things like crime and infrastructure going forward. We'll see how that plays.
Dave?
Well, I would say that I would agree with all my colleagues that the mayor's legacy will be a good one. He'll be remembered for some real progress. He did work on school issues. He has done some brick and mortar things. He did fall short on crime, but other mayors have done so. That's a very high bar for any mayor, and certainly Sly James is part of that. But I do think he also leaves a legacy that Quinton Lucas can learn from, and that is that top-down, only I can do it, go-away leadership is just not workable in Kansas City. And I think Quinton Lucas understands that any mayor has to be more collaborative, more transparent, more communicative than Mayor James was during his 8 years, and certainly in his last term, and that's a legacy that he'll leave as well.
Now, just as Mayor Sly James was preparing to leave office, the Kansas City Star takes him to task for spending one of his last weeks on the job in Hawaii. The mayor just returned from a U.S. Conference of Mayors meeting in Honolulu. The mayor says they were discussing important issues, including the impact of climate change on cities. Kat Reed, would the Star have cared if he was going to Cleveland?
I think any travel for someone this late in their term about to leave office is kind of strange, and it's harder to justify the use of taxpayer dollars on that. One thing that is interesting is Krista Dubill, when she sat down with the mayor, she said he wouldn't really divulge future plans, but several sources said he was headed into consulting. So was this trip used to perhaps build more relationships? I think that's a question that some people have.
What was the problem the Star had with that, Dave,
Well,
when climate change is such an important issue?
Yeah, Kat, of course, summarizes our concern, which is you're only in office for another 2 or 3 weeks. If you learned everything you could possibly learn about climate change, how could you then translate that into information that taxpayers would benefit from? Seems problematic. And let's face it, the location in Hawaii does make a difference 3 weeks out. So that was our concern. It wasn't a major thing, but it was something we needed to note.
A year ago this week, 17 people died as a duck boat capsizes on Table Rock Lake near Branson. These were the scenes we were witnessing this time last year. The tragedy prompted calls for changes in the law, and some wanted duck boats banned altogether. For all the talk, did any laws actually change, Steve Kraske?
They did not. In fairness, Missouri Senator Josh Hawley has followed up his predecessor, Claire McCaskill, in filing bills in the U.S. Senate to do a number of things, including requiring the use of life jackets on duck boats, that kind of thing. That bill is in committee. The last time I looked, it hasn't gotten anywhere. We're a year out, and that needs to change.
The actual duck boats have gone from Branson. It's now been turned into a laser tag activity. This time last year, you were on the program, Eric. You had just returned from Branson and had been on the Ride the Ducks. Would you go on those boats again?
Absolutely not. And it's more than just the life jackets. It's the canopy on the top. That's an issue. And of course, the weather would be an issue as well, because if you remember, my now 6-year-old son was one of the people that they let come up front and steer the duck boat. So no, I wouldn't go on there.
I was amazed, though, in the Star this week, Dave Helling, there was a story about how the community was split, and many people in that community actually did want them to return.
Right, and there are duck boat operations in other parts of the country. I do think the insurance industry is paying a lot of attention to some of these rules and regulations and raising insurance premiums for duck boat operations. That may be a private sector way of approaching this. But we should note, Nick, that the federal government seems particularly reluctant to involve itself on the congressional level with regulating amusement parks. You know, when the Schlitterbahn tragedy took place, we did some research on how the federal government might respond to inspection and design. And amusement parks are specifically exempted from federal control by the Consumer Product Safety Commission. They just don't like to touch this stuff. I'm not sure why. It may be that the amusement industry has a pretty powerful lobby, but that may be one explanation for the delay in this story.
While we don't like to repeat the same story over and over and over again on this program, some stories do linger week after week. One of those is the ongoing saga over property appraisals in Jackson County. Is it really as disastrous and devastating as some people are now claiming? This week, Preston Smith swung by KCPT to share a horrific portrait of what's happening. Smith represents the Blue Springs School District on the county's Board of Equalization. He says before all is said and done, there could be close to 40,000 appeals, and at 10 minutes per appeal hearing, that would take 4.6 years to wrap up. Now, let's do a quick round, if we can, of separating fact from fiction. Could that be right, Kat Reed?
So one thing I want to point out, 22,000 informal appeals already, and then they said to the Board of Equalization, which is a separate process, 6,000 there. So some of it, you know, people had to go ahead and file formal appeals before they heard back from those informal. So I think when you tally the numbers up, I think that we could be seeing something close to 30,000. I don't know about 40.
Another of Smith's contentions, 30,000 people could lose their homes. Really, Eric?
Yes. With the, if they don't put the cap on it, and now it's a discussion on whether the cap is legal, but if they are not, then yeah, you could have a lot of people lose their homes.
Yeah, we just briefly, the taxing jurisdictions could roll their levies back and lessen the impact on some of those homeowners. So it isn't clear that 30,000 people will lose their homes. And the legality of a sort of any type of cap is quite questionable. I mean, the state law seems pretty clear. You need to evaluate properties, residential and commercial, based on their value. And so I think the legal battle will continue to play out.
Well, and Jackson County had been, you know, in some trouble, I would say, with the state. The state told them you are undervaluing these properties, and that was back for the 2017 assessment. So there isn't a ton of sympathy, I don't think, on the state level, because they were told you need to bring these up to value.
Can we talk about that just for a moment? Gail McCann Beatty is getting all manner of wrath for the way this has been handled. Some of it justified, some of it not. But Kat is so right. What the problem here is what's preceded this issue. Jackson County has been undervaluing properties for a long time. The state has noticed it, has pointed it out. There wasn't a response from the county. That's the big issue here, because that's led to this all very quick rise in a lot of these assessments.
Kansas City Public Schools have lost $147 million in revenue that they should have gotten with accurate tax basis. So that's a lot of money, and that lets you know that this has been going on for a while.
Right, and it's not just, the plaza was undervalued by hundreds of millions of dollars for many, many years. That's an unpublicized tax break. Everybody thinks it's, the homeowner in a $50,000 or $60,000 house. Commercial properties were undervalued. I think the goal, executed poorly, that's right. The goal is to accurately and fairly reflect the property values of every parcel in Jackson County. They may be imperfectly getting there. It may cause some problems for some folks, but that has to be the goal, at least as I understand state law.
Some issues are big in the news for a while, and then you never hear about them again. How about police body cameras? It was a hot issue at one time, but seems to have been relegated in public consciousness. Now, Overland Park this week investing nearly $750,000 on equipping all of its 200 officers with the technology. That puts the spotlight back on Kansas City, Missouri Police, which, despite years of study, has still not adopted the cameras department-wide. At issue, apparently, is the cost, $6 million. If the police department had $6 million to spend, Eric Wesson, is body cameras the best use of that money?
Yes. Public trust. People can see what's going on when a police officer pulls you over. And for a lot of these police-involved shootings, the police have a perfect record with that out of all the homicides. Somebody probably did something wrong. So the body cameras would eliminate that doubt.
Well, we just had the mayoral race. Did body cameras actually even come up in that? Was that an issue that the public cared about then?
I personally did not hear body cameras specifically come up. If anything, in terms of use of money, they talked a lot about permanent funding for social workers at KCBD. They talked about community policing, which in some ways that does body cameras tie in with trust with the community, but this issue I never heard specifically discussed.
Steve.
I just want to underscore what Eric just said. This lack of trust between residents on the east side and the police department is a profound issue in this community. It's led to clearance rates that are too low for homicides in this community. This lack of trust just haunts the police department in terms of its ability to move forward and do the right thing. A lot of people, I think, would react to the $5 million and say we need to hire more police officers. I think Eric Wesson is exactly right. This matter of trust needs to be addressed. Body cameras will go a long way toward it, and that would help solve some of the east side crime issues.
Cast your mind back 2 years, and the superintendent of the Shawnee Mission School District was hitting the headlines for blocking teachers and staff from wearing safety pins in support of refugees. He claimed it was a political statement which had no place in a public school district. So what are we to make this week when the superintendent of one of our metro's largest school districts enters what some say is the political arena and starts blasting the President of the United States on his Twitter account? Dennis Carpenter, who leads Lee Summit Schools, calls Trump racist in chief. While he's getting support from some patrons, others claim he should stick to educating kids, and they contend he's abusing the Lee Summit Twitter platform to express political beliefs. The school district says it's his own personal account. Does that make a difference, Eric?
If it's his personal account, he has the freedom of speech, just like the president does. A lot of people would say the president needs to focus on running the country.
Is there a special obligation on a school district superintendent? We expect people like Emmanuel Cleaver and Sharice Davids to be engaged in this arena. Is this something that the school district superintendent should be involved in?
I think in normal times, the answer to that question is yes, Nick, that school district superintendents might be in a different category. But with this president of the United States saying what this president is saying, I think a lot of the rules, as this president has changed so many rules in our politics today, I think a lot of those rules are out the window. And I don't begrudge any leader from saying what he or she thinks about our leader of the free world right now.
Would the reaction be different at all, Kat Reed, if this was the head of St. Luke's Hospital or the head coach of the Kansas City Chiefs or the general manager of Worlds of Fun, for instance?
Well, it definitely is a different position. But the point I wanted to bring up, some people said, well, it was his personal account, not professional. People are held accountable all the time for things that they say on their personal Twitter pages. You're still a representative of the school district. And so I think that people who say it was personal, nothing is personal
Eric.
anymore.
With the Lee Summit climate now, especially dealing with the situation that they have with the racial issues that they have going on, I think it was a good time for him to say something about it to let people know that, hey, this is still going on here, and this is the climate that's in the country. This is what people are saying and what people
Dave.
are talking about.
I don't disagree with that. I would say it is a bit provocative given what's going on in the Lee Summit
No
District. I mean,
question.
it's not in isolation or a one-off. There's other things going on. And you do have to wonder what the reaction would be if a superintendent or a public figure tweeted support of President Trump. I mean, people would sort of go, well, now, wait a minute, is that appropriate for someone to, in essence, reinforce what the president said? So there are some nuances to this
I like that.
discussion, but he does have a right to say what he would think.
So if he was supporting the president, as superintendent was doing that, would that be okay if it was on their personal account, Eric?
Yes. Those women got on news the other day and supported the president, and they had high-profile positions as well.
You know, just briefly, Nick, these are extraordinary times when it comes to the President of the United States and what he's saying about people. And again, to underscore the point, I don't begrudge the superintendent from saying anything in response to that.
A few weeks ago on the program, we showed you these scenes from our nation's capital. These are Department of Agriculture employees turning their backs on their boss as he announces the USDA is moving its research units out of Washington and relocating them to Kansas City. This week we learn that most of them have now decided to quit the Agriculture Department rather than come here at all. Only 36% of affected workers have accepted their transfer assignments. Should we be offended or should we be relieved that there'll be hundreds of new good-paying jobs for Kansas Cityans as a result of this, Kat?
Well, listen, I don't think that they're turning their backs because Kansas City is an awful place to live or they think it's a bad city, because obviously it is an amazing place to live. But they are upset because they feel like moving it to Kansas City would maybe could kind of push them into the shadows a little bit more, maybe could put them at risk for their research not really being held, in the public eye, that it could just kind of relegate them a little bit.
There is a sense, though, that there is people don't like the idea of being what they call flyover country, though, right, Eric? One national newspaper this week, prominent newspaper, says these people would be marooned, quote, in Kansas City.
They might have a point. Coming from Washington, D.C. here probably would be a culture shock. There's a lot of things to do in D.C. and here. Pretty much roll up the sidewalks at 10:30, 11 o'clock. So it would be a lot. The cost of living is a lot cheaper here, though.
More than 20 years ago, the NCAA used to be here in Kansas City, the major organization that controls college sports, and then they decided to move to Indianapolis. And I spoke to one of the employees who was there back then who told me only about 30% of those folks from Kansas City went to Indianapolis. Should people in Indianapolis be offended by Kansas Cityans because of that?
No, I think when you have families with kids and schools and all those complications, it's asking a lot for to ask employees to uproot their lives and move halfway across the country. You know, there's a lot of kickback in Washington about this whole deal, Nick. What's really going on here is a jab at the USDA's ability to do the research that it does and to undermine that really is what the Trump administration is after here.
A foul ball traveling 91 miles per hour hits a young girl in the stands at Kauffman Stadium on Sunday. Now this week, the Kansas City Royals making it official. They're extending the nets at the K for fan safety. Was this latest incident the impetus behind the change, or is it totally coincidental?
I don't think it's totally coincidental. All major league teams are talking about extending nets to protect patrons in the lower deck. The Royals might have gotten to this point eventually anyway, but I think that the accident or the incident at the ballpark probably accelerated that discussion and moved it forward. It's a good idea. It's something that the team ought to be doing.
Now, just like a foul ball at a baseball game, some things are totally out of your control, like the weather. Union Station finding that out this week as it pulls the plug on what they touted as the most Instagrammable experience of the year in KC. The aerial artwork called Reflecting Motion was damaged in last week's storms. It's now considered too expensive to repair and has been removed. It was to be on display until the first week of September. Now, many of our metro's biggest malls have gone out of business in recent years as the retail landscape changes. Now, the Independence Center Mall is totally reinventing itself. How about, along with shopping, going on an aerial ride like this, or scaling a climbing wall, or teetering high in the air on a rope course? It's all coming this winter to Independence Center. Malls are not the only ones trying to reinvent themselves, so are airports. All around the world, they're now adding kids' attractions, free video games, movie theaters, and swimming pools. These are scenes from the new terminal that just opened at Singapore Airport, which brings us to KCI, which this week is asking the public which features from stores to restaurants they want in our new $1 billion terminal. Okay, Kat Reid, we often hear that we are a world-class city and we are building a world-class airport. So any swimming pools, movie theaters coming to our new look KCI?
Listen, I don't think we need movie theaters. I think we need more than one Starbucks once you get through security. And I think that that is what people are asking for. You know, KCI, they're holding all of these public outreach sessions to get, feedback from the public, but also talk to some business owners about how they can get involved in the new terminal. And they talk about wanting something that is truly Kansas City, that provides this sense of place. And I think for a lot of Kansas Cityans, that means a lot more than barbecue. I think we will see barbecue, but other things.
I thought all of this was already happening. Is this really window dressing, or are they really interested in the public's view on this at this point?
I think they want to get some idea what the public wants. They're still early enough in the design game to do that. I'm hoping they install one of those zip lines so former Mayor Sly James can be one of the first to take a ride coming down the new airport.
Is there any feature that you would like to see in this new airport, Eric?
Someplace to get your shoes shined. I think this is like one of the only airports I've ever been in that there's no place to get your
That's
shoes
interesting.
shined.
That used to be such a staple.
It
Look
is.
how quickly the technology and the expectations for airport terminals are changing, Nick. What you just showed from Singapore there, that's what KCI needs to begin to think about as it moves forward here.
I do see there can be 9 mothers' rooms so that they can breastfeed. That's a big step up, too.
That is. Also, they're including a special sensory playground so that children with autism, they're keeping them in mind as they're designing.
Aha, so we do have a playground at this. What happened to the fountain that they had originally? Is that still going to be part of the design?
I think that the original fountain was deemed, that was 2 stories, was deemed to just be kind of implausible, but fountains are still going to be in there.
10 seconds. There is a dispute over public art at the airport involving the Municipal Art Commission and who has the say, and we'll take that up at another program.
And that is our Week in Review. Our thanks to our news reviewers, keeping you up to date weekdays at 11 on KCUR, Steve Kraske, and from 41 Action News, Kat Reid. From the Call newspaper, Eric Wesson, and from your Kansas City Star, Dave Helling, I'm Nick Haynes. Thanks for being with us.